I woke up before the alarm. Not by much, maybe 15 minutes, but enough to hear the soft clink of Mark getting his tackle box from the hall closet. He always moved quiet when he thought I was asleep. That small courtesy stung more than it should have. Going early? I asked, my voice rough from sleep. He glanced over his shoulder, already half out the door. Yeah, thought I'd meet the guys at the bridge. I nodded, pulled the blanket up. Good luck. Thanks. The door shut behind him, and I heard the rumble of the truck fade into the background hum of morning. I stayed there for a minute, listening to the cicadas warm up and the drip of last night's rain off the awning. Our town, Slade Bay, didn't rush to start its day. Saturdays moved slow here, like the air had weight. Eventually, I got up, made coffee, and wandered out back to the small converted shed that served as my tattoo studio. It used to be Mark's workshop. Now the smell of old wood was layered with ink, disinfectant, and faint traces of menthol. Clients usually didn't show up on weekends. Locals came on weekdays, on lunch breaks, or right after shifts. Saturdays were dead quiet unless someone walked in off the road. That almost never happened. I opened the blinds and caught sight of someone across the fence line. New guy. Jason, I'd heard someone say. He'd moved into the old Dawson place, bare-bones house, overgrown yard. Right now, he was kneeling by a beat-up motorcycle, arms greasy, brow furrowed. I sipped my coffee and watched him a moment longer than I should have. He looked like someone trying to fix something more than just an engine. Worn boots, worn shirt, worn eyes. I didn't plan to talk to him. But when he banged his knuckles on the exhaust pipe and swore under his breath, I grabbed the small tool, kit from my bench, and walked over. Need a better socket wrench? I asked, leaning on the gate. He glanced up, startled. Took him a beat to place me. You're the tattoo girl, he said. Sure am, and you're the guy cussing at a Yamaha. At 8 a.m., he cracked a smile, tired, but real. It's a triumph, actually. Could have fooled me. He wiped his hands on a rag that didn't help much. I'd take the wrench. I passed it to him and crouched beside the fence, coffee mug dangling in my free hand. You from around here? Nope. Grew up in Baton Rouge. Been gone a while, though. Military? He shook his head. No, just gone. I didn't press. People who come back to places like Slade Bay usually do it for one of two reasons: trouble or family. Sometimes both. You working? I asked. Not yet. Staying with my dad till I figure things out. He didn't look the kind to need figuring out. But again, who does until they do? Bike yours. Was my brother's. I didn't say anything after that. Just watched him work for a bit, the easy rhythm of it. He didn't talk much, which I appreciated. The quiet felt comfortable, like two people occupying the same breath without needing to fill it. Eventually, he finished what he was doing and stood, stretching his back. Appreciate the help. I nodded and turned to go. Come by the shop. If you ever want something permanent? He looked at me, like he was about to ask something else, but didn't. Just gave a short wave. I went back inside, sat in my chair, and stared at the sketch I'd started days ago, a moth breaking out of glass. Couldn't tell if it still meant anything. Outside, the bike didn't start, but he kept trying. The next time I saw him was 3 days later, just after lunch, when the sun sat high and made the pavement steam like it was trying to return to the sky. I was sorting through ink cartridges, trying to figure out whether I had enough of the deep green to finish a design someone had asked about last week, when I noticed movement through the blinds. Jason was out there again, elbow deep in the same motorcycle. Whatever he'd fixed last time, it clearly didn't stick. I wasn't planning to go over. I'd already done the neighborly thing, offered tools and small talk. But something about the way he looked at that engine, like it owed him an answer he couldn't quite make out, made me set the tray down and grab the toolbox again. Not because he needed the help, not really, but because I needed the distraction. The house was too quiet, the air inside too still. Back at it? I asked as I pushed open the gate without waiting for an invitation. Jason didn't look up immediately, just kept fiddling with a cable like if he let go it'd spring loose and cut his fingers. I should have torched it a week ago, he muttered, then finally met my eyes. But yeah, still at it. You want honest advice? Not particularly. Well, I'm giving it anyway. You should have ditched it and bought a used Civic. He smirked, then sat back on his heels and wiped the sweat from his face with the hem of his shirt. There were tattoos on his ribs, partially hidden. Faded, done in someone's kitchen probably, and all the more real for it. You always this generous with your time? He asked, motioning to the wrench in my hand. Only when the alternative is sorting receipts or listening to my husband rant about bait quality. He tilted his head slightly, not surprised exactly, but interested in a way that made me suddenly aware of how close I was standing. I crouched down beside him, holding the flashlight while he worked in silence for a while. The hum of cicadas and the occasional squawk of a bird from the pine trees filled the spaces we didn't bother trying to fill with words. It was that kind of quiet that either feels peaceful or dangerous depending on your state of mind. Eventually, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my throat since last time. So why Slade Bay? Why here? Jason didn't answer right away, just kept working the bolt, jaw tight. Then, like he was reading from a script he'd written in his head 100 times but never said aloud, he muttered, "My mom passed last fall." Dad called. After 20 years of silence, said he could use a hand with the house. Figured I had nothing better to do. I let that hang there. Not because I didn't have questions, but because I knew that look, like saying too much too fast might make it all real in a way he wasn't ready for. You and your dad talk much? I asked, softer. We don't talk. We exist in the same space. Feels like enough for now. The wrench slipped and scraped his knuckle. He hissed through his teeth, but didn't swear this time. I reached over without thinking and held the flashlight closer. You were gone a long time. Yeah. You back for good? He didn't answer. Just gave me a look, not guarded but not open either, and went back to the engine. That's when I realized we were talking about more than geography. And maybe he did too. When he finally got the part in place, he sat back again, wiped his hands, and looked at me like he was about to say something else. But instead, he just nodded and said, "Thanks for the light." I stood, stretching my legs, and smiled without showing teeth. You want company that doesn't ask too many questions? My shop's always open, unless it's Sunday. Then I'm in bed with coffee and crime docs. He gave a quiet chuckle, and for a second, something settled in the air between us. Not attraction exactly. Something less urgent, but somehow heavier. As I walked back, I didn't look behind me, but I heard the sound of the bike trying to start again. Still stubborn. Still familiar. It was late afternoon when he walked into the studio, just as I was cleaning up after a no-show appointment. The bell above the door gave its usual half-hearted jingle, and I glanced up from the counter, expecting one of the regulars who often dropped by just to chat or reschedule without notice. But it was Jason, standing in the doorway, slightly out, of place but not uncomfortable, his shoulders relaxed and his gaze moving slowly across the framed artwork and half-finished sketches taped to the wall behind my chair. He looked like he'd stepped inside not just to ask for something, but to understand the kind of space it really was. Maybe even what kind of person I had to be to work in it. "I was wondering if you had time for a consult," he said, his voice low but certain, like he'd already spent a week convincing himself to say it out loud. I nodded toward the chair and set my cleaning rag aside. "You've got good timing. Just had a cancellation." He moved closer, not hurriedly, but with a kind of deliberate calm that made it feel like he wasn't sure how the room would treat him. He sat down across from me, rested his hands on his knees, and after a moment of hesitation, he pulled a folded, slightly crumpled photo from his back pocket. He handed it to me without saying anything. It was a photo of two boys, maybe 17 or 18, standing in front of a beat-up car with surfboards strapped to the roof. One of them was unmistakably Jason, leaner, younger, eyes full of some kind of quiet mischief. The other boy looked a bit older, taller by an inch, but their faces shared something unmistakable. Brothers, without a doubt. "That's Caleb," Jason said, eyes on the photo. "Not me. He died 3 years ago." I didn't offer condolences. He wasn't asking for them, and words like that always felt clumsy anyway. I just nodded and waited for whatever came next. "I've been thinking about a memorial piece," he continued. "Something simple. Not his face or anything dramatic. Just something that won't fade the way everything else seems to." I liked the way he said it. Not for effect, not to impress, but because that's exactly what he meant. I pulled a sketch pad from the drawer, turned to a blank page, and asked what symbols came to mind when he thought of Caleb. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I almost thought he'd changed his mind. But then he said, he used to draw this wave. Not like a real one, just his version of it. Sharp, kind of messy. I'd find it on his notebooks, the back of receipts, the garage wall. He said it was how he pictured his brain, always crashing, never stopping. That's a hell of a metaphor, I said, already sketching the rough arc of it, letting the line rise and fall in a motion that felt like it could keep going forever. You want his name in it? Jason shook his head. No, just the wave. Maybe his initials tucked in somewhere. But quiet, not loud. I nodded again and kept drawing. We didn't talk much after that. Just a few words here and there. Mostly practical stuff about placement, color, how soon I'd have a mock-up ready. But somewhere between the second version and the third, something shifted. He looked at me, and it wasn't one of those lingering, overplayed gazes that end in something predictable. It was something far more dangerous. A moment of mutual recognition, like we'd both stumbled into something we hadn't meant to find. I didn't think I'd feel anything coming in here, he said quietly, almost like it surprised him. But talking about him like this, it's different, like I'm holding something steady for the first time in a while. I didn't have a clever reply, so I just looked at him, and the silence that stretched out wasn't awkward, it was full. When he stood up to leave, he hovered by the door, his hand on the knob but not turning it. Then he looked back at me, eyes darker now, more serious than they'd been earlier. Thanks. For the wave. And for not asking me things you already knew I wouldn't answer. I should have just nodded, let him go, left it as something clean and self-contained. But instead I said, You didn't have to come in today, did you? He smiled, soft and tired, and after a pause said, No, I didn't. He opened the door, stepped halfway through, then turned back for just a second, like something in him hadn't quite settled. And then it happened. The kiss. Neither of us moved fast. There was no urgency, no awkward scramble. He leaned in slowly, just enough that I knew I could pull away if I wanted. But I didn't. I let it happen. It was soft, not searching for anything, just a press of truth between two people who hadn't touched anyone honestly in too long. Then he pulled back, eyes wide, like he'd startled himself. I'm sorry, he said instantly, voice rougher now. I didn't answer. I just gave the smallest nod because there was nothing to explain. The door closed behind him, and I stood in the middle of the room, heart not racing, not floating, just beating, heavy and sure, like something I'd forgotten was still inside me. The day Laura showed up, the sky was already thick with heat, the kind that makes everything feel slow and slightly unreal, like the town is holding its breath for something that never quite arrives. I was restocking needles and reorganizing the stencil drawer when I heard her voice out front, sharp, cheerful, and just a little too polished to pass as casual. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, and knowing her, that wasn't a slip. It, was a statement. I stepped out from the back, wiping my hands on a towel, and there she was. Exactly how I remembered her, but maybe with a little more edge around the eyes, like the shine she always wore had started to chip at the corners. She wore heels that didn't belong on our side of town, and a blazer that would have made more sense in a bank office than in front of a converted shed with a flickering neon open sign. You weren't answering your phone, she said, like that was an explanation and a complaint in one. I've been working, I replied, not unkindly but without decoration, and motioned for her to come inside. She stepped through the door with a careful sort of grace, scanning the room as if expecting it to reveal something I'd rather keep hidden. Her gaze landed on the sketchbook open on the desk, and she moved toward it instinctively, though she didn't touch it. Instead, she tilted her head and gave that familiar half-smile, the one that said she knew more than she was saying but hadn't decided yet whether it was worth saying at all. Business. Going okay? She asked, leaning against the counter like it was a social visit, not an inspection. It's steady, I said. Slade Bay doesn't have a big market, but it's enough. And Mark? she asked next, casually, the way people ask about someone when they're not really interested in the answer but want to see what the question stirs up. He's fine. Fishing a lot. She nodded slowly, eyes still moving around the room, and I could almost hear her calculating which parts of my life had shifted and which ones I was pretending hadn't. That was the thing with Laura. She didn't need to ask. Direct questions to get to the center of something. She just waited for the silence to start bending. We made small talk after that, half-hearted updates about her husband, a few names I barely recognized from her circle, and some passive commentary on how Slade Bay hadn't changed a bit. But the whole time, I could feel it, something beneath the surface of her words, like a net being drawn tighter with every casual sentence. Eventually, she glanced at the chair in the corner, the one I always kept empty, even when things got busy, and said, "You've been quiet lately. I figured you'd call me when the thing with the art grant fell through." I shrugged, not out of dismissal, but because I honestly didn't know what I would have said. That version of me, the one who used to dream out loud to her over cheap wine on the porch, felt like someone I used to know but hadn't missed in a long time. "I've had a lot on my mind," I said finally, which was the closest I'd come to the truth without unraveling more than I could gather back up again. She let that hang there for a second before pushing off the counter and moving toward the door. Her hand hovered on the handle, and she turned back just slightly, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "I don't know what's going on with you," she said, "but just so you know, people are paying attention. This town's small, but it has good memory." And then she was gone. I stood there for a long time after the door shut, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the far-off barking of a neighbor's dog. It wasn't that Laura had said anything threatening. She hadn't needed to. The threat, if there was one, wasn't in her words. It was in the way she'd looked around the room like it didn't match what she remembered about me. I sat back at my desk and stared at the wave sketch still sitting half-finished. I picked up the pencil and tried to keep working, but my hand felt disconnected from the page. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, and it wasn't fear either. It was something harder to name, something that sat just under the skin like a splinter, tiny, persistent, impossible to ignore. The truth was, I didn't know what Laura had seen or what she thought she saw. But I knew her well enough to understand that she wouldn't ask directly, not until she already had the answer she needed. And that meant I didn't have time to keep pretending I was invisible. For the next few days, I threw myself into work, like it was something that could drown out thinking, like maybe the steady buzz of the tattoo machine or the comfort of sterile gloves and predictable lines could keep my mind from slipping back into things I wasn't ready to name. I took every appointment I could, even the walk-ins I usually declined on weekends, and when I wasn't tattooing, I was reorganizing supply drawers that didn't need organizing or redrawing flash sheets that no one had asked for in years. I knew what I was doing, stalling, hiding in the rhythm of busy hands and small talk that didn't require any real presence. But I did it anyway, because the alternative felt like letting everything unravel all at once. Mark came home early, one afternoon, holding a coffee cup from that place near the mill that he always pretended to hate but never stopped going to. He stepped into the studio without knocking, which he used to do out of habit, but now felt more like a test, like he was checking to see if the world inside had changed in his absence. He set the coffee down on the edge of the counter and looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, or like he was trying to remember something he used to know. "You've been busy," he said, and even though his voice was calm, it carried a kind of hesitation I wasn't used to from him, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to make small observations anymore. "Walk-ins picked up," I replied, wiping down the station even though I'd already done it 10 minutes earlier. "People getting restless, I guess." He nodded and leaned against the doorway with the coffee still untouched, watching me in a way that felt like he was trying to figure out whether I was real or some version of me he'd missed the creation of. Then, without any build-up or warning, he reached out and touched my shoulder. Not with hunger or even affection, but with the kind of gentleness that reminded me how far apart we'd drifted, without either of us marking the moment it happened. "Everything okay with you?" he asked, and I could tell by the way he asked it that he already knew the answer wasn't a simple yes, but he was still hoping for one anyway. I didn't look at him when I answered, because I didn't trust my face not to give away things my Voice was working hard to keep still. I'm just tired. Been a long couple of weeks. Mark didn't push, didn't ask anything else, and I wondered if that made him noble or just exhausted in a different way than I was. He stood there a few more seconds, then nodded to himself like he'd made peace with not knowing everything, and finally left without taking the coffee cup with him. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual after brushing my teeth, not out of vanity or any hope of clarity, but because I felt like if I stared long enough, maybe I'd recognize whatever it was that had started shifting inside me. My reflection didn't look different. Same hair pulled back in the same way, same faded tank top with the same bleach stain on the collar. But the expression in my eyes was foreign. Not sad exactly, but unsettled, like I'd just been handed something fragile and didn't know how to hold it without breaking it. I tried to go to bed after that, but my body wouldn't settle. I kept shifting beneath the sheets, flipping the pillow, watching the ceiling like it might offer answers if I stared long enough. Mark was in the other room by then, watching TV on low volume, probably half asleep on the couch like he'd started, doing more and more often lately. I didn't blame him. Sometimes being in the same bed with someone who feels a mile away is lonelier than sleeping by yourself. At some point, I gave up trying to sleep and went back into the studio, turning on just the desk lamp and sitting in front of the sketchbook I'd left open earlier. The wave sketch was still there, half finished, and beside it, another page I'd started idly, an outline of two hands reaching but not quite touching. I didn't remember drawing it, but it felt familiar in a way that made my chest ache. Picked up a pencil and started adding detail to the wrists, shading in veins and bone lines. Anything to keep my fingers moving and my mind quiet. But no matter how much I focused on the paper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in my life had already slipped past the point of easy repair, and I was still pretending it hadn't. I didn't know what would happen next, or what I even wanted to happen, but I knew one thing for certain as I sat there in the half-light, alone with ink stains on my fingers and questions I couldn't yet speak out loud. Whatever peace I'd once had in this house, in this job, in this version of my life was gone, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted it back. The invitation came without ceremony, slipped between words during a quiet evening that had started with nothing more than a walk. Jason showed up around dusk, the light already leaning, golden and long across the rooftops, and asked if I wanted to get out for a bit. No pressure, no destination, just a stretch of the legs along the shoreline behind town, where the pine trees gave way to marsh, and the sky always felt just a little bigger than it did anywhere else in Slade Bay. We walked without hurry, side by side but not touching, and for the first mile or so, we didn't say anything more meaningful than the usual. How the bugs were worse than last year, how the water levels seemed lower, how the smell of salt and mud always reminded him of summers he didn't really want to remember. There was a rhythm to our steps, uneven but oddly comfortable, like we were both tuned to something we didn't fully understand but recognized anyway. Eventually, as the last of the sun sank behind the trees and turned the sky a kind of burnt copper, Jason slowed a little and let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it all day. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and that made it feel less like a confession and more like a fact he was finally tired of keeping to himself. "I've been thinking about leaving," he said, his voice quiet but steady, like this wasn't the first time he'd said it aloud, just the first time it had been meant for someone else to hear. I didn't answer right away, partly because I didn't trust myself to speak without overstepping, but mostly because I knew he wasn't finished. "There's a job in Texas, nothing special. Construction, decent pay, no questions asked. Friend of a friend runs the crew, said he could use another guy by the end of the month. I figured maybe a fresh start wouldn't be the worst idea." I nodded slowly, not out of agreement or encouragement, but because I understood exactly what he meant, down to the weight behind the words he wasn't saying. Slade Bay had a way of clinging to people who didn't belong anywhere else, and sometimes the only way to breathe again was to put real distance between yourself and everything that had started to feel too familiar. "You'd go alone?" I asked eventually, careful to keep my voice neutral, though the answer mattered more than I wanted it to. He glanced at me then, not for long, but enough that I felt the full weight of his honesty when he said, "I would. But if you needed a reason to get out of here too, I'd offer you a seat in the truck. Not for romance, not for anything complicated, just because I think maybe we both need the same kind of silence for a while." It wasn't a proposal, not really. It was an invitation to something undefined, something that could be escape or relief, or even just a few hundred miles of road where no one knew our names. He didn't reach for my hand, didn't step closer, and that restraint said more than any touch could have. It told me he meant it, and that he wouldn't push, no matter how badly he might want me to say yes. I looked out over the water, the tide just beginning to slip in again. The sound of it folding over the rocks, soft and slow like breathing. There was a pull in my chest, not sharp but insistent, a quiet urging to go, to leave everything behind. The guilt, the whispers, the soft collapse of a marriage that had already happened in silence. And yet, even in that moment, with freedom, sitting right there in front of me, I couldn't say yes, not because I didn't want to, but because I still didn't know who I was outside of this town, this shop, this version of myself I'd spent years building even if it no longer fit. I don't know what I want, I said finally, the words tasting bitter because they were true, and because I'd avoided saying them for far too long. Jason didn't react, didn't sigh or look disappointed. He just nodded like he'd expected it, maybe even respected it, and after a few more steps in silence, he changed the subject, asked what kind of needlework I preferred for fine-line lettering, as if we could both pretend, just for a few minutes, longer that we were nothing more than two people talking shop on an evening walk. When we reached the edge of the path where the land curved back toward the main road, we stopped without discussing it. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and looked at me like he was seeing something he'd already decided not to reach for again. I meant what I said, he told me quietly. No pressure, no promises, but if you decide you want out, I'll keep the passenger seat empty for a while. And then he turned, just like that, and headed back the way we'd come, the fading light catching the back of his shirt and making him look, for one strange second, like someone I might have known in another life. I stood there until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, until the sound of the water and the wind in the trees was all that was left. Then I walked back alone, slow and steady, each step heavier than the last, like I was dragging something invisible behind me that I couldn't name yet, but that I knew I wouldn't be able to carry for much longer. I didn't notice the envelope, until after lunch the next day, when I stepped outside to get some air and found it half-tucked under the edge of the mat in front of the studio. No name, no return address, just plain white, a little smudged at the corners like it had been. Handled more than once before being dropped off. For a second I thought it might be something from a client. Maybe a tip left anonymously or a thank you note, which had happened a few times over the years. But the second I picked it up, I knew it wasn't that. The weight of it was wrong. Too light to carry kindness, too careful to be random. I stood there with it in my hand for a moment, unsure if I even wanted to open it, and then I took it inside, locked the door behind me, and sat down at my station like I was about to start a session. The studio was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the faint creak of the ceiling fan, and when I slid my finger under the seal and pulled the paper free, I felt something shift in my chest. Small, subtle, but undeniable, like a fault line adjusting under the surface. There weren't many words. Whoever wrote it hadn't wasted ink or emotion, just laid it out in a way that felt both restrained and deeply personal at the same time. They didn't sign it, didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't threaten or beg or accuse directly, but every line pressed into me like a quiet bruise. You think you're just helping someone, but maybe you're only helping yourself. Maybe you should ask what happens to the people you leave behind when you go fixing strangers. Not everyone wants their pain reopened just because you're bored or lonely. Slade Bay sees more than you think. People talk, people remember. There was nothing dramatic about the language, no anger or venom, but somehow that made it worse. The calmness in the phrasing felt more deliberate, like the writer had been thinking these things for a while, holding them in, letting them settle until they were no longer a burst of emotion, but a cold fact. I read the letter twice, then folded it back up and stared at the countertop, trying to pinpoint the emotion spreading in my chest. But it wasn't fear, not exactly. And it wasn't guilt in the way I expected either. It was something sharper, something that made my skin itch, and my thoughts feel too loud all at once. I had no way of knowing who sent it. My first thought was Laura, because she was the only person who would have both noticed and cared enough to say something without saying it outright. But even that didn't feel quite right. Her style was more face-to-face, more calculated and clean. This letter felt messier, like it came from someone who knew too much and had no idea what to do with that knowledge, someone who couldn't keep it inside but couldn't come forward, either. It could have been a client, someone who'd seen me talking with Jason, someone who'd heard something they weren't meant to hear and assumed more than they should have. Or maybe it was someone closer, someone I hadn't even thought about in months, someone who'd always watched from the edges and waited for me to slip. I sat there for nearly an hour, the letter untouched on the desk, before finally getting up and locking it in the drawer under the counter, not because I thought it would disappear if I hid it, but because I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. After that, I couldn't work. I canceled the afternoon appointments, turned the sign to closed, and went back into the house, where the air felt heavier than usual, and every room seemed just slightly off, as if the space itself knew something had shifted and didn't quite know how to settle back into place. I tried to clean, to cook, to write down a supply list for the next shipment, but none of it stuck. Every time I sat still for more than a few minutes, my mind circled back to the same thought. I had crossed a line I hadn't even seen until I was already on the other side. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness in the room broken only by the faint blue glow of the hallway light that Mark always left on, even though we both pretended not to notice anymore. He didn't say anything when he came in late, just stepped into the bedroom, grabbed a change of clothes, and went back out without asking why I was awake. I listened to the soft shuffle of his movements in the other room, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't avoiding me out of anger or confusion. He was just giving me space to decide something I hadn't even admitted I needed to decide. The letter hadn't told me anything I didn't already know deep down. It had only said it out loud, and now the silence I'd been hiding in felt thinner, less protective, more like glass waiting to crack. I didn't sleep. Not even a little. It happened late, not in the middle of an argument or after some dramatic discovery, but during one of those quiet nights where the whole house felt paused in between breaths. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-full mug of tea gone cold, staring at a piece of paper I wasn't reading, the letter still sealed, way in my studio drawer but echoing just as loud in my chest as if I had it right in front of me. The window was open, and the breeze coming through smelled faintly of fish and gasoline, the scent of the docks where Mark spent most of his time lately. And I wondered, not for the first time, what exactly kept him going back there day after day when I knew he hated the noise and the weight of pretending to care about the same stories from the same men every time. He came in through the back door, his boots dusty, shirt clinging to, his back with the kind of sweat that comes from hours spent standing still in a place where you don't belong anymore. He didn't speak right away, just put his keys on the counter and stood with his back to me like he was waiting for something to pull him in a different direction. I stayed where I was, still holding the paper like it might eventually give me something useful, and for a long minute, we both sat in that silence, neither of us brave enough to ask the question we'd been circling for weeks. When he finally turned to face me, his expression wasn't angry or sad or even confused. It was tired in a way that felt old, like he'd been carrying something long before either of us had admitted there was a weight at all. "You're somewhere else, all." "The time now?" he said, and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation laid out like a puzzle piece between us. I could have deflected, could have told him I was stressed or distracted or not sleeping well, but those weren't answers, and we both knew it. So I didn't say anything at all, and in the silence he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, elbows on the table, hands clasped together like he was trying to keep them from shaking. "I don't think this is about anyone else," he said, and I flinched slightly even though his tone was gentle. "Not really. I think you've been slipping away from yourself for a while, and I just didn't want to admit I was watching it happen." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw every line on his face that hadn't been there when we got married, every shadow under his eyes that I'd stopped noticing somewhere along the way. He wasn't blaming me, but he wasn't saving me either, and something about that, about the calm of it, hit harder than any argument ever could have. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I said finally, the words coming out low and rough, not because I was holding back emotion but because there was too much of it sitting right at the surface. Mark nodded like he'd known that already, like he'd been waiting for me to say it out loud so he could stop pretending it wasn't true. "I don't need you to fix it," he said. "I just needed to know if you saw it happening too." I wanted to say something that would make it better. Even just slightly, I wanted to tell him I could try harder, or that we could go back to whatever version of ourselves we used to be before everything got so quiet between us. But the truth was, I didn't believe in that version anymore, and I wasn't sure he did, either. "I see it," I said, and when the words settled between us, I realized how heavy they were, how final. He stood then, slowly, like the conversation had pulled something from him he wasn't ready to carry anymore, and for a moment, I thought he might reach out, might put a hand on my shoulder or brush a strand of hair from my face like he used to. But he didn't. He just looked at me one last time and said, "I'm gonna sleep on the couch." And then he was gone. I sat at the table long after the lights were off, long after the silence had settled in fully, and I realized that he hadn't left the room because he was angry. He'd left because he understood something I hadn't been willing to admit until that exact moment. Sometimes, distance isn't created by arguments or betrayal, or even love fading out. Sometimes it grows from everything left unsaid, and once it's there, you can't shrink it back to the size it used to be just by wishing it away. And maybe that was the real fracture. Not the letter, not Jason, not any one decision, but the slow erosion of the thing that used to hold us together, and the quiet acceptance that neither of us had the tools to rebuild it anymore. It had been a few days since the conversation with Mark, and though nothing dramatic had changed on the surface, everything felt different in that subtle, disorienting way, where you start to notice how many silences have replaced once effortless moments. He still moved around the house in the same patterns. Coffee in the morning, boots on by the back door, truck engine rumbling to life around 7. But he stopped pausing to ask if I needed anything, and I stopped pretending I was waiting for him to. We were both just going through the motions of routine, like two people sharing a space but not a life. And maybe the worst part was how easy it had become not to fight that truth. When Jason showed up again, it wasn't in the middle of some dramatic scene or timed for maximum effect. He came by late in the afternoon, just as I was finishing up with a walk-in who'd asked for a delicate rose on her collarbone, the kind of job that usually calmed my nerves but had left me unusually restless this time. I'd been expecting him in a way, not that day specifically, but eventually, because people like Jason don't just vanish after laying something honest at your feet. They either come back to finish the conversation or disappear for good, and I had already decided which one he would be. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open and stepped inside like he had before, quiet but certain, and stood near the counter while I peeled off my gloves and tossed them into the bin. His eyes scanned the room quickly, not nosy but aware, and when they landed on me, he didn't smile and he didn't hesitate. He just got to the point in that low, measured way of his that always felt like it carried weight without trying to. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, and the way he said it told me this wasn't just a plan anymore. It was real, locked in, the kind of decision that already had a duffel bag zipped shut and sitting by the door. I nodded, not out of surprise, because I had known something like this was coming, but because the finality of it still stung in a way I hadn't prepared for. "I figured you would," I said, and I watched the way his jaw tightened just slightly, like he didn't love hearing that but respected that I'd said it anyway. "There's a motel outside of Marshall where the crew's meeting before the first job," he continued, his voice steady but softer now, like he was trying not to put too much pressure on what he was about to say. "It's rough work, long hours, but it's quiet out there. Nobody knows me. Nobody asks questions." I didn't interrupt, just crossed my arms and leaned against the chair, waiting for whatever came next. "I'm not asking you to run away with me," he said, and the words weren't romantic or theatrical, just honest, like everything else he'd said since we met. "I'm just saying if you ever needed to go, really go, I'd make space for you. Not because I expect anything, not because of what happened between us, but because I think maybe we're both stuck in places we outgrew a while ago." The room felt heavier after he spoke, not because of the words themselves, but because of how much they didn't demand from me. There was no begging, no persuasion, no dramatic plea, just an open door with no sign over it, no conditions attached. It was the kind of offer most people never get, and I knew he wasn't the kind of person who'd repeat it twice. I looked at him for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure if anything I said would matter, as much as what I didn't say. There was a part of me that wanted to ask what his plan would be if I showed up in Texas with nothing more than a backpack and no idea what came next. There was another part, quieter but more honest, that wanted to ask if he'd be disappointed if I didn't come at all. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said, because it was the only thing that hadn't changed in weeks. The only truth I could stand on without feeling like a liar. Jason nodded, his face unreadable but not cold, and stepped back toward the door with that same slow patience he always carried, like he'd made peace with every possible answer before he ever asked the question. "I just wanted to say it out loud," he said, "so you wouldn't wonder." And then he was gone. I stood in the studio long after the sound of his truck faded down the street, the late sun casting long shadows across the floor, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't reach for anything, not a pencil, not my phone, not a distraction to carry me out of the moment. I just stood there and let the offer settle into my bones, simple and unfinished, waiting for me to decide whether I would let it pass or follow it into something I couldn't name yet. It didn't happen with shouting or slammed doors or a suitcase, flung into the driveway like some messy television breakup, and maybe that's what made it harder to sit with. There was no clear rupture, no dramatic scene to replay later in my head and assign blame to. Mark didn't even wait until morning. It was late when he walked in from the garage, his shoulders sagging and his face carrying that quiet kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. He smelled like engine oil and sun-dried cotton, like he'd been trying to find something to fix for hours, and had finally decided it wasn't worth the effort anymore. He set the duffel bag down beside the hallway bench, the one his mother gave us when we moved in, and he didn't look at me right away, just stood there with his hand resting lightly on the strap like he wasn't sure whether to lift it again or just let it become part of the furniture. "I'm going to stay at the unit for a while," he said, and his voice wasn't bitter or wounded, just hollow in a way that made my throat tighten. I didn't ask which unit. I knew he meant the apartment above the machine shop, the one they kept for visiting vendors or guys who stayed late too often to bother going home. It wasn't much. A kitchenette, a pull-out couch, the faint smell of rubber in the walls, but it was enough space for someone who no longer wanted to sit across the table from someone he couldn't talk to. I didn't cry, and neither did he. And I think that scared me more than anything, how calm it all was. We'd been together for 10 years, shared bills and birthdays and the kind of inside jokes that only work when you've watched someone fold laundry 1,000 times. And still, in that moment, we felt like strangers standing in a hallway neither of us had intended to turn into a goodbye. "I'm not mad at you," he said, and for a second I hated how gentle his voice was because it felt like pity, even if I knew it wasn't. "I just don't think we're helping each other anymore. Maybe we haven't been for a long time." I wanted to argue with him, not because I disagreed, but because I wasn't ready to be the kind of person someone gave up on so quietly. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't said something sooner, why we hadn't tried harder, why we'd both sat in the same house for months pretending not to notice that it had stopped feeling like a home. But I didn't ask those things, because deep down I already knew the answers, and maybe he did too. Instead, I nodded, just once, and stepped aside so he could get to the door. He paused before opening it, looked back at me like he wasn't sure if he should say one more thing or leave it exactly where it was. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the spare key to the shed, my studio, and placed it gently on the entryway table. "You'll be okay?" he said, not as a question or a promise, but as something in between, like he was trying to convince himself that letting go didn't mean walking away completely, and then he left. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or loud. It was flat even, like the sound of something settling into the shape it was always meant to take, and for the first few minutes I just stood there in the hallway, staring at the key and the empty space where his bag had been. I didn't feel free, and I didn't feel abandoned. I felt something closer to blank, like I'd finally reached the edge of a long road and had no map to tell me what came next. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't move the key. I didn't go into the bedroom or check my phone or try to distract myself with a movie I'd already seen 100 times. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, wrapped in an old throw blanket that still smelled like summer bonfires and lemon detergent, and I waited for the weight of it all to catch up with me, and when it finally did, It didn't crush me the way I thought it might. It just filled the room, slow and steady, like water rising under a closed door. It was still dark when I woke up, not to any sound or sudden thought, but to the quiet sense that something was already happening. The house felt thinner somehow, like the walls were holding their breath, and I didn't bother to check the time because it didn't feel like morning or night. It just felt like the space in between. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping to the floor without resistance, and the air felt cold even though it was probably just the stillness making everything sharper. I didn't get dressed properly, just pulled on jeans over my sleep shorts and slid into a hoodie that still smelled faintly of eucalyptus detergent and tattoo ink. I moved through the house like I was trying not to wake something, even though there was nothing left to disturb. When I stepped outside, the morning air hit me like a wave, wet and earthy, with the distant smell of gasoline and pine drifting in from the tree line beyond the road. His driveway was already half empty. The truck's tailgate was down, and the back was mostly packed. Duffel bags, a rolled-up tarp, a dented metal cooler, a black case I assumed held tools. Jason stood at the driver's side, his back to me, head bent as he checked something in the front seat. He didn't flinch when I stepped onto the gravel, didn't turn around like he hadn't heard me, though I knew he had. There was no surprise between us anymore, just the steady reality of people who had run out of ways to pretend. I walked slowly, not because I was unsure, but because it felt wrong to rush into a moment that didn't belong to either of us alone. When I reached the edge of the truck bed, I stopped, not close enough to touch him, not far enough to call it distance. He turned then, his face blank for a second before something behind his eyes shifted. Recognition, maybe, or quiet resignation. He didn't speak, just gave me the smallest nod, like he understood why I was there even though I hadn't made up my mind until that exact moment. "I didn't come to stop you," I said, my voice low and steady, even though my chest was doing that tight, slow ache it hadn't done since the night Mark left. "I just didn't want you to think I didn't care." He looked at me for a long time, and it wasn't the kind of look that asked for answers or apologies. It was the kind that felt like closing a book in the middle of a sentence, like accepting that not every story needs an ending that makes sense. "I didn't expect you to come," he said finally, and there wasn't judgment in his tone, only something gentler, like a small sadness that had already settled in and made peace with itself. I nodded, unable to find a better response, and for a moment we just stood there. In the dim light, the world around us still too sleepy to interfere. A bird called out in the distance, one of those long, low cries that always sounded more like warning than song, and Jason glanced back toward the road like he could already see the path stretching out in front of him. He closed the tailgate slowly, not slamming it, but letting it settle into place with a soft thud that felt more final than any words either of us could have offered. He didn't ask again. He didn't repeat the offer or leave space for hesitation. He just looked at me one last time, and in that look was everything we hadn't said. Every conversation we'd started and never finished. Every glance that meant more than it should have. Every moment that had slipped too far past the line to be called innocent. And then he got into the truck, shut the door, and started the engine. He didn't pull away fast. He let the wheels roll slowly over the gravel, like he was giving the silence a chance to say something on his behalf. I didn't wave. I didn't move. I just watched the red of his taillights fade into the gray morning, and when he turned the corner at the end of the road without stopping, I felt the breath leave my body like it had been holding out for a different choice that was never going to come. I stood there for another minute, the chill crawling up my arms and the sound of the wind slipping through the trees behind me, and I knew, deeply without hesitation, that he wasn't coming back. There wouldn't be another walk, another quiet conversation at dusk, another offer made with no strings attached. What we'd had wasn't a beginning, and it wasn't really an ending either. It was a fracture in time, one we'd both stepped into for a little while, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be seen. And now it was gone. I turned back toward the house, the gravel crunching under my feet louder than anything else, and when I reached the door, I didn't go inside right away. I just stood there, hand on the knob, letting the silence settle again. Not heavier, just different.